My name is Bill Holstein, and I'm president of our foundation. After our presentation, you'll have more time to have more drinks and more connections, more commingling, so that we're not killing it for the whole evening. Our last public event was February 28th, 2020. 3 full years today, minus 1 day. And I'm here to tell you that the OPC Foundation has survived. We're here. Tonight's reception is our first step, just a first step, towards resuming our normal in-person activities. So this is not the end-all and be-all, it's just part of the rebuilding process. Throughout the pandemic, we continued to help create careers for talented young people. We've been able to do that partly because of the passion of Jane and Kat Riley, and because of a strong and really committed board of directors, which includes representatives from several major news organizations. Working together over the years, we have created entire generations of foreign correspondents all over the world. I was pleased to read in today's New York Times, Ben Hubbard writing about the earthquakes in Turkey. He was one of ours. We sent him to the AP Bureau in Ramallah years ago, and one thing led to another. Some of this year's winners will be going to AP, Reuters, and Wall Street Journal bureaus in Bangkok, Mexico City, London, one either to Paris or Dakar, and one somewhere in the Middle East. So we are in the actual act of launching their careers. It brings me immense pleasure and pride to launch a new award this evening in the name of Seymour and Audrey Topping. Top was, and Audrey remains, true heroes to me for their absolutely breakthrough reporting in China, where I also served, but also in the Soviet Union, Vietnam, and in many other places. They dedicated most of their lives to the sacred mission of being correspondents on the ground, something that the young people who are being recognized tonight recognize and accept. The whole Topping clan, it seems, is here this evening with their first winner, Chris Chan. Would you please stand and let us recognize the Toppings? Audrey discovered those soldiers at Xi'an, isn't that right? You discovered that archaeological dig at Xi'an.
That's right.
Right. That's amazing. So now we'll go to the winners' videos tonight. Thank you. Lights will go down again.
My name is Francis Tan, and I am a senior at Syracuse University. On June 30, 2020, China passed the Hong Kong National Security Law, which further restricted free speech in the region and had worldwide ramifications. For my first front-page story at the Daily Orange, I examined how this law jeopardizes free discussions of China-related topics in the US classrooms. One professor I interviewed said the law triggers fear and often results in self-censorship. A student from Hong Kong even said she wasn't sure about whether to go home or not after college. I realized how one law enacted thousands of miles away could still affect people like them and journalists like me living in the US. I want more people to know that international news can have its local impact. And that's the very reason that I want to become an overseas correspondent, to bring meaningful news to people across the world, and to shed light on global events that could resonate with readers anywhere. I want to thank Dr. Margarita Estevezabe, who sparked my passion in learning and researching politics of Japan, the country that I want to be covering in the future. I want to express my sincerest gratitude to the OPC Foundation for such a prestigious honor. Thank you.
Everyone has one story they can read 1,000,000 times and never get tired of reading. For me, that story is about a 12-year-old girl who grew up in a household where her father left his family, as her mother faced mental illness, poverty, and struggled to raise 2 children on her own. This was a story about me. My brother and I did our best to support our mother, yet I couldn't help but feel powerless. Through writing, I was able to escape from it all and be a child. One day, I took my writing to a platform called Episode Interactive and wrote a fiction story about mental health at just 14 years old. The story soon got more than 100,000 reads, with many people telling me that they were inspired by my story. My love for writing set me on the path to journalism, where I aspired to work in areas that serve underprivileged populations. Through my undergraduate studies, I was fortunate enough to write about politics and health for national news outlets ranging from Teen Vogue to Republica. My passion for journalism further motivated me to pursue a master's degree at New York University, where I was elected to be a Reuters Fellow and intern with the Wall Street Journal this spring. Through my writing, I want to inspire up-and-coming journalists to turn their struggles into success. Thank you, OPC, for this award.
My name is Yusuf Runab, and I'm a recent graduate of the Greg Newmark Grad School of Journalism at CUNY. I grew up in Algiers, Algeria, where I worked for national newspapers, including Al Watan and Liberté. In 2018, I moved to New York, but a year later, protests broke out in Algeria and resulted in the ouster of then-President Bouteflika. As a journalist, I knew I needed to be there. So I went back home looking for stories to tell, stories that I couldn't report for Algerian outlets, however. The government especially targeted local journalists and political activists. But I wanted the world to know what was happening in Algeria. It was my first time reporting from abroad, and I was able to publish a few stories elsewhere. It was an interesting experience because, as I also read other foreign coverage of the protests, I realized that while reporting internationally could shield you from censorship, it presents you with a higher risk of misrepresenting your sources and perpetuating some of the harmful narratives and tropes about the places you cover. As an international reporter, I am looking to tell stories from places where I speak the language for a readership whose decisions and taxes impact those very places. I am fluent in French, Arabic, and English. My goal is to do fair and sensible journalism, where being who I am enhances my reporting for both my reader and my source. I would like to thank the CUNY J School and the Overseas Press Club Foundation for helping me move in that direction.
Bright fluorescent lights and loud instructions in Ukrainian over a crackly loudspeaker jarred me awake in the midst of my 12-hour bus ride from Poland. As my American passport attracted long looks from border agents, I thought about how I wound up here, on a dank bus on the border of Ukraine at 3 a.m. with a war raging nearby. My name is Madeline Long, and I'm a junior at the University of Richmond studying history and English. As a sophomore in high school, a global history class assignment led me to interview my aunt about her study abroad in the Soviet Union in 1987. This was my first foray into journalism. My Pulitzer Center reporting trip to Ukraine, like the interview of my aunt in her Iowa kitchen, sprang from a fascination with this part of the world. I was curious to investigate a particular angle of the Russo-Ukrainian War, the role of religion and national identity. Within a few moments of my arrival in Lviv, the sound of a bugle stopped all conversation on a busy street. Ukrainian hands covered their hearts as a hearse approached the city council building, carrying the body of Alexei Kanin, a volunteer in the Ukrainian armed forces, killed on the front lines a few days ago. As the hearse pulled away, everyone, from tram drivers to toddlers, made the sign of the cross. That small gesture bespoke a larger story that developed over long days of interviews. The role that the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church has played in shaping Ukrainian national identity, and the role of that identity in this war. I'm incredibly grateful to the OPC Foundation for their support so that I can continue learning about and reporting on the history, people, and beliefs behind the daily headlines surrounding conflict and war. Thank you.
The setting sun cast a pink haze over the sandy washes and rocky ravines of the Saudi desert, where I came upon an encampment of camel herders. The wind tore at the mismatched blankets and tarps which provided them shelter. I had traveled by bus and a tad of hitchhiking from Israel all the way to Saudi Arabia to see ancient ruins carved by nomads who had established extensive trade routes despite some of the planet's harshest conditions. But the most impressive living testament to human resilience and mobility I encountered were these Sudanese refugees now pouring me a tall bottle of camel milk. I am Andrew Calif, and I major in journalism and anthropology at New York University. My dream to tell stories from the world's most remote corners began as I grew up in Ohio. I know it's a cliche, but National Geographic freed me from a prison of cornfields and illuminated a world of astounding diversity. But in studying anthropology, I realized academia is a lot less about fighting Nazis and a lot more about footnotes than I was expecting. Not everyone can be Indiana Jones, and ethically, no one really should be. After traveling with communities of Bedouins from Egypt to Saudi Arabia, I realized my path was becoming a foreign correspondent. I went on to document Mongolian reindeer herders forced to choose between tradition and survival due to climate change. This only helped me refine my career goal, which is to amplify indigenous, nomadic, and pastoral voices from the intersection of climate change, migration, and conflict. I plan to use the OPCF's funds to embed myself amongst indigenous groups across Africa's Sahel Belt, where desertification and conflict have displaced large quantities of people. Thank you.
My name is Simon Levian, and I'm a student at Harvard from Sparta, New Jersey. In early 2021, a Harvard professor in Boston wrote a white paper that was so controversial it spurred protests halfway around the world in Seoul, South Korea, where I was studying at a local university. The professor's paper argued that comfort women, a term used to describe women and girls who were forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese army during World War II, were not coerced, but were willing participants. The paper was widely criticized by officials in South Korea, Japan, China, and even North Korea. I headed straight into the coverage with my Boston colleague from the Harvard Crimson to report this story. I wanted to capture every perspective. We meticulously crafted a reference document for our coverage that ultimately clocked in at over 30,000 words, or the size of a small novel. We interviewed as many people as we could. We interviewed protesters who were furious at Harvard's inaction. We landed an exclusive interview with the professor and poked holes in his paper in real time. We tracked academic discourse over the paper as it evolved on both sides of the Pacific. Our extensive reporting resulted in an authoritative 8-article series that I believe portrayed the history of comfort women and the professor's controversial claims in fair and accurate terms, a series that the New York Times and a number of international media outlets cited. When I returned to Boston from Seoul, I found myself in the middle of even more protests. This time, mostly Korean Americans protesting the professor's paper right outside Harvard's gates. Never before had I seen or been at the center of a story that spanned the whole world. But ever since, I've been passionate about traveling around the world to get those stories. And I'm grateful to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for giving me the support to continue making the dream a reality. Thank you.
I'm Noha, a senior at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I'm ethnically Bangladeshi on my mother's side, a country that won its freedom in 1971 after a brutal and systematic genocide. My mother immigrated to the U.S. in her 20s, leaving behind the life she painstakingly built for herself, hoping that her eventual kids would have the freedom to pursue their dreams in a way that's less culturally and economically feasible there. She herself had wanted to be a journalist when she was around my age, but decided against it, in large part because of a lack of safety in the industry in South Asia, particularly for women. I've now been able to do things I don't think she realized were possible for women my age. I've had bylines with the AP, Bloomberg, Politico, the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, and others. But I've never forgotten the people of Bangladesh who live lives much different from mine. I was able to go to Dhaka, the capital, and speak to hospital workers and patients during the pandemic, and their gratitude showed me the power of being an American writer writing about somewhere else. My father's an immigrant to the U.S. too, from England. I'll be heading there with the Wall Street Journal this June via an OPC fellowship. It is a dream come true to honor my heritage by taking the opportunities I've received in America and engaging with where my family originally hails from in tandem. I'm incredibly grateful to the OPC for both the financial backing and the opportunity to become part of such a storied legacy in overseas journalism. This is a dream come true not just for me, but for the woman my mother sacrificed becoming so I could become her instead. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zane Irwin. I'm a senior at Swarthmore College. I've written about racism in Kansas City and revolution in Tunisia, but I'd most like to tell you about the time I accidentally interviewed a warlord. First, a bit about how I got there. Before she died in 2016, my mom moved my family to London on a social worker's salary, just so she could take us beyond our comfort zones. When a Pulitzer Center grant let me report from anywhere in the world, I took this contrarian spirit to Cameroon. Using my non-native French to conduct interviews and teaching myself video editing from the weak Wi-Fi of cyber cafes, I reported on a civil war few Westerners have heard of. In the process, I stumbled on an exclusive interview with a self-styled social media warlord. I met him on Facebook Messenger. The account seemed to belong to a prominent separatist, but the day of the interview, I discovered he was an imposter, which is a scary realization in the context of a civil war. After taking safety precautions, I wound up spending 4 hours in a bakery of all places, interviewing a man who spreads disinformation, peddles propaganda, and orchestrates killings from his smartphone. If social media is aiding murder in Cameroon, what else is happening in our peripheral vision? These kinds of stories, the ones I want to tell, are outside the mainstream by definition. I want to thank the OPC for helping me break stories off the beaten path.
I'm Marina Song, a senior at Northwestern University. I've interviewed US representatives in the members' dining room inside the Capitol and chatted with a former Apple engineer who designed the first iMessage, but I stumbled upon one of my most memorable interviews when talking with a Chinese high school student. Because of financial restraints, he had to live near a garage for a few months after his school closed due to the pandemic, and he told me how this change affected his competitiveness as he applied to universities. The summer after the outbreak of COVID-19, I returned home to Beijing and wrote an article about how the pandemic widened the gap between the wealthier and the less privileged students in China. It was difficult to find sources at first because I was trying to reach high school students who had very limited resources. However, I persisted and used social media as well as personal connections to find and interview more than 30 students from varying backgrounds. And this feature story was eventually published in the Washington Post. Speaking Mandarin, French, Spanish, in addition to English, I would love to become a foreign correspondent in Europe or Asia several years after graduation. Thank you so much to the OPC.
My name is Lucy Papachristou, and I'm a recent graduate of the CUNY Journalism School. When I was 22, I landed a job at a global investigative news outlet headquartered in Bosnia, the closest at the time I could get to Russia, the language I had studied in college. This was already interesting, but life got all the more interesting when I started volunteering at a ramshackle refugee shelter just outside Sarajevo, where we housed families with small children from across the Middle East and North Africa. Years passed, and I returned to Bosnia to cover Europe's refugee crisis from a remote village along the Croatian border. I wrote stories about Bangladeshi men drowning in small rivers. Stories about Afghan fathers being beaten by border guards on the way to reunite with their children. I learned that knowledge comes from time. Moments when nothing is happening, the conversation falters, and you put your notebook aside It comes from gathering firewood with your interview subjects so they can offer you tea. It comes from looking at photographs of people's children whom they haven't seen in years. Patterns repeated over and over until their truth is etched into you. My career has shifted since then. I live in New York now, and I cover technology as an intern for Bloomberg News. But as I build a career as a foreign correspondent, hopefully covering Russia and the former Soviet space, I intend to hold those values close. Thank you in advance to the Overseas Press Club Foundation for getting me there.
Good evening. My name is Daniel Shayla. My journey into journalism began writing a blog about my lockdown pet project, swimming across the English Channel. As the months went on, I found myself writing less about training and more about where I was training, how Britain's lakes, rivers, and beaches were changing as people gradually returned to them. I grew up in cities from Hong Kong and Singapore to London, but this experience sparked a passion for exploring, writing about the spaces where human and environmental stories collide. Now I've moved to New York to study at Columbia's Graduate School of Journalism. So far, I've investigated state mismanagement, broke the story of a federal lawsuit against Con Ed, and reported on flooding and mystery sewage. Using data, photography, and audio, I'm learning to maximize the impact of my reporting. These were stories ranging from public health and disability to the legal world and political lobbying, but they were all also stories of the environment and the changes our climate is experiencing, which is why I want to be a climate correspondent and why I'm grateful to the OPC for giving me this support. Because I believe the next generation of migration reporters, war correspondents, political and economic pundits will all need to also be climate reporters. In all of my writing, wading in sewage or swimming across the English Channel, I found an urgency which in the future I hope to bring to the front lines of climate reporting, wherever they may be. Thank you.
My name is Viola Flowers. I'm a sophomore journalism major at Stony Brook University and was born and raised in Waterbury, Connecticut. I was drawn to foreign reporting after listening to lectures by international correspondents Lindsay Hilsum and Nima Elbegir. The way these women spoke of their work and their community of female journalists struck a chord with me. They had a deep passion and dedication to the critical stories they were telling, along with the desire to help the subjects of those stories wherever they could. I felt those same sentiments this past fall when I met Tatiana, a 31-year-old Ukrainian refugee studying at Stony Brook. A deeply generous woman, Tatiana was offering her professional graphic design skills to me and our campus newspaper, all while trying to figure out her documentation to stay in the US. Her story was one I knew I needed to share. Tatiana and I spent hours talking about her family back in Ukraine, her love of color theory and creative design, and the horrific circumstances that brought her to Stony Brook. I watched her face, I listened intently, and I made mental notes as she described the bombs detonating blocks away from her Kyiv flat and the enemy planes flying just above her car as she fled the city. As a reporter, I was able to give Tatiana the opportunity to share her story in her new yet temporary home. As a friend, I could show her I truly cared and offer her the camaraderie and support she needed. This is the impact I aim for with my work. I want to share voices like Tatiana's through my writing, reaching audiences around the world with stories just like these. I want to thank the Overseas Press Club Foundation for this opportunity and look forward to a successful career as an international reporter. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Devin Martin. I'm a student at the Columbia Graduate School of Journalism, and I'm from Boston, Massachusetts. I grew up in a family of storytellers, or as they call them in Ireland, where my family's from, Shanachie. These are people who, according to tradition, spend their evenings knocking on strangers' doors and regaling them with tales of both fact and fiction, though usually a mixture of both. As a child, nearly every dinner table, taxi ride, or hotel room lobby was a theater for a masterclass in storytelling. And this is partly the reason why I decided to move to Ireland for college, where for 3 years I wrote about European economics, entrepreneurship, and finance for Ireland's leading publications. During my time there, I was fortunate to cover the country when it was undergoing one of its most economically tumultuous periods in recent history. I covered Brexit, the impact of COVID on Irish enterprise, and the government's battle against a continent-wide minimum corporate tax rate. With the aid of the Overseas Press Club, I look forward to growing my career in the European financial press, covering more complex and impactful stories in business through other parts of Europe. Thank you.
My name is Kyla Malig and I study at Columbia Journalism School. I was born in the Philippines and I grew up in a Filipino-Chinese household. My very first memory of traveling to another country was actually shrouded with fear. I was 4 and my parents and I had taken a vacation trip to South Korea. One day, my parents had left me at the daycare center to run errands, but I couldn't comprehend back then why I was surrounded with children who looked like me but didn't sound like me. I started crying, and the teacher, in her limited English, had no way of communicating with me, decided to brave the winter and unite me with my parents. That moment and her kindness always stayed with me. As I grew older, I started volunteering at orphanages and shelters for sexually abused women. I learned of their strength and the heartbreaking stories they carry. As I traveled more around Asia, whether it be to Vietnam or Thailand, I always felt the ghost of my own home, be it in the form of poverty or exploitation, especially felt by women and children, in the presence of another, just brought by a different set of systems in history. Before working for Rappler and the Washington Post, I traveled with my colleague to the underdeveloped communities of urban Manila for our master's project. We reported on the orphan children of former President Duterte's drug war. These children witnessed the murders of their parents inside their own homes, and they felt like they were the aftermath of a war they never knew were waged against them. These children were left behind without parents, and until now, without an answer. Knowing these atrocities occur in different parts of the world, I am eager to become a foreign correspondent who covers them and help uplift the voices often silenced by those in power. Being such a journalist will be an immense honor and responsibility, and I can't thank the Overseas Press Club enough for giving me the opportunity to do this line of work.
Hi, I'm Eugen Tang, a graduate student in NYU's literary reportage program. I was born and raised in Linhai, a small county in eastern China, before going to Shanghai, where I studied journalism at Fudan University. I worked as an intern reporter for several Chinese publications and for the Beijing bureau of the New York Times. For the Times, I profiled a group of Chinese high schoolers who produced a film exploring transgender identity. After graduation, I traveled across China working as an investigative journalist at Southern Weekly, a weekly newspaper, and a feature writer at Renwu magazine, a monthly magazine known as China's New Yorker. My biggest story began in mid-February 2020, when I noticed Chinese social media posts about the rising COVID cases in Wuhan nursing homes. Despite many rejections, I finally convinced the head of one nursing home to give me an interview. She told me some suspected cases had appeared in her nursing home and hadn't been strictly quarantined. Within an hour after I published my investigation in Southern Weekly online, the story was taken down by the authorities. Despite the challenge, my story reached more than 350,000 readers within that 1 hour and pushed the Wuhan government to take epidemic prevention in nursing homes more seriously. That year, I wrote 13 stories for Southern Weekly about the Wuhan pandemic. Of those 13, 1 got deleted after being posted, and 2 never appeared. Those experiences have driven me to study and pursue journalism in a country where the media environment is very different from China's. I hope to produce quality journalism about China, technology, and Asian immigrants in the US. I thank the Overseas Press Foundation for recognizing my work and giving me an opportunity to intern at a reputable media organization. Thank you.
Hakeem answered the door after a couple of knocks, letting me into his Detroit apartment. I noticed his crutches, the mismatched furniture, and the baby crying in the next room. In the merciless July heat, a fan was the only relief. My name is Raza, and this summer I reported for the Detroit Free Press. This was an interview I had been looking forward to for weeks. I'd struggled to find a refugee who would talk to a reporter, until I met Hakeem. He had evacuated from Afghanistan a year prior and had finally settled down in Detroit after spending several months in flux. I was continuing our chatter until he said, "Journalists just come with their minds already made up. They plan their article and use whatever parts of our story fit." I tried not to feel affronted by this comment. How many times had I walked into an interview assuming I already knew what they had to say? In that moment, I truly saw him. A refugee tentatively trusting a young journalist with a deeply personal story. I felt the gravity of the task. I had a duty to my audience, but also to him. Growing up Muslim in the Midwest, I quickly understood the importance of diverse stories that directly impact our communities. Whether in the mountain ranges of Pakistan or on the front line fighting against a pipeline, I approach each subject with humility and respect, ready to learn first and write second. Thank you to the OPC Foundation for their support as I continue to cover underreported stories.
Hi, I'm Rachel Nostra, and I'm a graduate student at New York University in the Business and Economic Reporting program. 7 years ago, though, I was a United States Marine forward deployed, serving as a Middle Eastern cryptologic linguist. It was my job to take the things that I saw and heard and turn them into intelligence reports and provide warnings for my fellow Marines and allied partners. But the problem with gathering information, gathering stories, is that a weight settles on you if you can't share them. And for security reasons, I've never really been able to talk about what I experienced overseas. But now as a journalist, I have the unique privilege of telling other people's stories. And it's a process I've come to love in the past year or so that I've been in this field. After getting out of the Marine Corps, after nearly 6 years of service, I went on to get bachelor's degrees from Pennsylvania State University in international politics and journalism. And I have since written for a number of publications, including VT Digger in Vermont, covering the state legislature's eugenics apology to Indigenous peoples, and working for Military Times, covering an array of subjects from PFAS contamination in the Gulf to the tumultuous relationship between former President Trump and top military brass. Thanks to the Overseas Press Club, I feel like I now have the opportunity to pursue a career outside of the United States, something I've always dreamed. And it's an endeavor that I began last April when I went to Ukraine to report on the invasion. For New York Magazine, I wrote an article about an American woman who was single-handedly pulling out Ukrainian women and children from behind Russian-occupied lines. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, and I can't wait to continue to tell the stories that I was unable to tell as a Marine.
I first met Boris in 2020 at the Liberty Square in Taipei, Taiwan. Boris had fled Hong Kong because of government persecution after he led the pro-democracy protests in the summer of 2019. There are two choices left, he told me. Stay here or go home and get arrested. Back then, I'd been covering the Hong Kong protests for several months, watching the citizens standing out for their freedom while facing police brutality. And through the protesters like Boris, I was able to continue documenting the journey of Hong Kong girls who had no choice but to be farewell to their hometown after fighting for its autonomy. Growing up in Taiwan gave me a front row seat to witness how a nation and its people survive between two superpowers. Now I'm inspired to use my skills as a video journalist to tell the stories of those everyday people in the Great China region who simply want better and freer life. With the support of the OPC Foundation, I feel confident to trust my instincts and continue to bring important, impactful stories alive with my camera across the world. Thank you.
Just incredible. Just incredible how we find these young people year after year, and they want to pursue the paths that many of us took in our own lives. So it's always very gratifying personally to me. So this is the end of our formal presentation. Would all the winners and their families and their sponsors please come forward for photographs? Please, everyone else, have another drink, an appetizer, and keep connecting with these future correspondents. I've told them all, walk around the room and look at everybody's name badge, and if you see somebody you want to talk to, say, Bill says I can talk to you. So go for them. And so, okay, invite the winners come up, and winners and sponsors. And so many of you in the room tonight have the power to make their dreams come true. Please help them. Thank you very much.